How many people does it take to write a novel? One, usually. Established authors typically have editors, of course, but it is feasible and common for a single writer to produce a novel. The same could be said of a composer writing a solo for an instrument that they play. The creation of a new piece from start to finish is largely carried out by a single person. Other voices typically have a say in shaping many of these works, but there's a clear figure at the center. But how many people does it take to create a film? More than one, usually. Some filmmakers, even some fairly prominent ones, get close to doing it all themselves. Shane Carruth, for instance, fulfilled pretty much every major role for his acclaimed science fiction film Primer. Fulfilling many roles is more common for filmmakers behind low-budget indie movies, but even then it's pretty uncommon for a single person to do everything, or even to do most of the work. Typically, there are many people who exert significant creative control over a film. First off, a screenwriter has to actually create the script in the first place. Producers and executive producers handle the financing and execution of a project. This is typically more of a logistical role than a creative one, but producers certainly have a say in the shaping of a film. A cinematographer, also known as a director of photography, handles camera-related decisions and has significant control over the look and feel of a film. Gaffers set up each shot's lighting and sometimes contribute to lighting design. An editor takes the footage that's been recorded and assembles it into a cohesive whole. Other members of the post-production team handle visual effects. A composer creates the score, and then there are set designers, costume designers, sound designers, and makeup artists, not to mention all the people in more logistical roles who may not have creative control, but who make the whole operation possible. Production assistants, grips, camera operators, catering crews, and a whole lot more. This was all a long-winded way of saying that a lot of people have a hand in creating a film. Even if we exclude purely logistical roles, a film's creative decisions are still typically made by quite a few people. So, who do we think of as the author of a film, as its central creative leader? Usually the director. Exact roles and responsibilities vary from director to director. Directors bring a screenplay to life by guiding actors through scenes, collaborating with the director of photography to craft shots, and working closely with the editor to put together the final product. They have a hand in just about everything. Some directors maintain significant control over every stage of the filmmaking process. Some are known for writing and directing their own screenplays, but others defer more creative control to their collaborators. Many other people contribute to the decision-making process, but the director usually gets the final word on a film's creative elements. But the status of the director as a film's author has a rich and sometimes contested history. To understand this idea, which we've come to know as Auteur theory, we need to go back to 1948. Ed Sikov tells us how Alexandra Astruc used the term camera stylo or camera pen to describe the way a film director uses his or her camera and sound recorders, lighting equipment, and so on as a sort of writing instrument, a means of self-expression. Astruc pushed back against the idea that a director's role is simply adapting a screenplay into a film. Rather, the best directors created an entirely new and intensely personal work of art, with the screenplay being only a blueprint for story, plot, dialogue, and characters. This is an interesting distinction. It might be natural to think of the creation of the screenplay as the primary creative act in the filmmaking process, but to Astruc, the screenplay is just the raw material that a director works with. Maybe this is an extreme analogy, but it's as if a screenplay is clay and the director is a sculptor. Astruc's ideas turned out to have a pretty significant legacy in film theory. They influenced François Truffaut, a well-known film theorist and director who is central to the French New Wave, to build upon the camera pen model to help create something called politique des auteurs. By now, you can tell that I did not take French in high school. Here's Sikov again. Not only did certain directors express themselves with their films, but what they expressed was especially worth expressing. Truffaut didn't call it the politique des auteurs for nothing. His championing of certain directors, Howard Hawks and Alfred Hitchcock at the top of the list, over others, Billy Wilder most notoriously, expressed a kind of artistic politics that was based not only on judgments about a director's visual style, but also in large measure on the perceived moral quality of his or her worldview. This framework codified the idea of director as author, or auteur, when Andrew Sarris turned Truffaut's politique des auteurs into the English term auteur theory, and ranked about 200 Hollywood directors according to their ability to create a worldview over the course of their careers and the quality of that worldview. The popular narrative around the history of Hollywood cinema tells us that Sarris heralded the arrival of a new Hollywood, an era in which significant creative control was afforded to directors, an era that brought us films like The Graduate and Night of the Living Dead. This golden age ended, so the story goes, with flops like Heaven's Gate. The film's director, Michael Cimino, was looking to maintain his momentum after his previous film, The Deer Hunter, earned rave reviews from critics. But Heaven's Gate was a complete flop and pretty much torpedoed United Artists, the film's production company. The film's failure is frequently cited as a major turning point that forced studios to exert more control over directors' creative decisions and ended the glory days of American authorship. The film might mark the end of the new Hollywood era, but I think it's easy to exaggerate its influence on the idea of director as author. The 80s did, after all, see the ascendance of Spike Lee, Martin Scorsese, Ridley Scott, David Lynch, David Cronenberg, and more, and I don't think many people would argue that they aren't auteurs. But the centering of directors as film's authors has its detractors. To understand the opposition to auteur theory, we'll go back to 1941 to talk about a little-known movie called Citizen Kane. One of the most famous feuds in cinema history centers around a question that is very relevant to the topic we've been discussing today. Who deserves credit for creating Citizen Kane, which is considered by many to be the greatest film of all time? I don't have enough time to go through all the twists and turns in this feud, but the gist of it is that Herman J. Mankiewicz, the co-author of the film's screenplay, accused Orson Welles, the film's director and leading man and the screenplay's other co-author, of trying to take full credit for the film when Mankiewicz is actually responsible for most of its writing. This controversy was a big deal when the film was released, but it was reignited by Pauline Kael, a prominent film critic for The New Yorker. In an extended essay called Raising Cain that was published in 1971, 30 years after the film's release, Kael argues that Mankiewicz's contributions to the film have been downplayed and that the fixation on Welles as the creative genius behind Cain undermines the contributions of all the other people that contributed to the film. Very early in his life as a prodigy, Kael writes, Welles seems to have fallen into the trap that has caught so many lesser men, believing his own publicity, believing that he really was the whole creative works, producer, director, writer, actor. She sums up her view of the situation towards the end of the piece. Those who admire Citizen Kane, which is constructed to present different perspectives on a man's life, seem naively willing to accept Welles's view of its making, namely that it is his sole creation. To generalize this perspective and put it more succinctly, auteur theory might be a sham. Focusing on the director as author model leads us astray from understanding how films actually come together. Kael's ideas continue to find a foothold among film theorists. In 2006, David Kipen developed something called Schreiber theory, Schreiber being the Yiddish word for writer, as an alternative to the dominant auteur theory. Kipen built on some of the ideas pioneered by Kael in order to center the screenwriter rather than the director as the true author of a film. This idea has been met with some criticism. Some opponents argue that he still gives too much credit for a film to a single person, but just chooses someone other than the director. We won't go too deep into the theory's nuances, but it's worth knowing about some of the ideas that have cropped up in opposition to the director-centric model. So we've gotten an overview of auteur theory's historical origins and taken a few detours to see how some theorists have developed opposing models of film authorship. I think this historical perspective does a few things for us. First, it emphasizes the degree to which film is a collaborative medium. It's convenient to discuss a film as if it has a single author, but it's important to remember that major decisions are typically made by a few people. Second, it underscores the fact that there's an open discussion surrounding film authorship. The debate about who, if anybody, should be considered a film's creator is by no means closed, and there's plenty of space for new understandings of film authorship to be added to the mix. So we'll keep this complexity in mind, but for convenience's sake, we're typically going to treat a film's director as its author. If we make this assumption, how do we apply auteur theory to develop an understanding of a director's stylistic tendencies and artistic preoccupations? I think the best starting point is the building blocks that we started this series with, and that we continue to return to. Technical elements. After watching a few films by the same director, try to apply the analytical techniques we developed in the first 5 videos of this series in order to identify techniques that persist across films. Maybe after watching a few Wes Anderson films, you'll notice his emphasis on symmetrical shot composition. Or maybe you'll start to wonder why Oliver Stone's films use an editing style that might be described as hectic or feverish. You might even ask why Michael Bay loves lens flare so much. These examples are pretty conspicuous things that you are probably going to notice if you have a familiarity with technical elements and are watching a film closely, but keep an eye out for more subtle tendencies as well. This gets easier to do as you get some practice with watching films closely. After looking at a director's stylistic tendencies across a few films, start to think about the kinds of stories they're drawn to. Are there any particular themes that emerge in a range of their films? Are there any similarities between characters and plots? If If you watch a few films by Ari Aster, you'll probably notice that he's interested in examining belonging and intergenerational trauma. This kind of literary analysis is a bit of a departure from what we focused on so far in this series, but it's an important step towards developing an understanding of a director. I think the most important step you can take, however, is connecting a director's use of technical elements to their thematic preoccupations. This is something that I've emphasized a few times in this series. It isn't enough to simply notice that a film or set of films uses a particular technique. That's a useful first step, but it doesn't tell us anything about how a director is creating meaning. If we can take that next step and connect a director's stylistic tendencies to the themes that they're exploring, we'll get a clearer sense of what that director is all about. So after you notice Wes Anderson's affinity for symmetry, pastels, and whimsy in general, ask, so what? How does that contribute to the themes that Anderson is preoccupied with? How does he use those technical elements to advance a thesis, to explore an idea, to say something about a theme or about film itself? I also think it's worth pairing analysis of a director's preoccupations and tendencies with an analysis of the genre that they seem to be operating in. My video on understanding genre is a good starting point for this kind of analysis. Take Clint Eastwood, for example. His career was built on films that are now among the most famous examples of the Western genre. But his later films, like Unforgiven, deconstruct the genre of the Western and pose questions about the tradition that built his career. Although he didn't direct those earlier Westerns, I think this is a particularly striking example of a filmmaker challenging a narrative that they contributed to earlier in their career. This demonstrates the value of thinking about auteur theory in conjunction with genre, but it also shows us how thinking about multiple films in tandem allows us to trace the evolution of a director's worldview across the arc of their career. Overall, I definitely think it's worth acknowledging the limitations of auteur theory. I think it's pretty clear that we're trying to apply an older model of authorship, one that centers a single creative figure as the driving force behind a film, to a medium that may not always lend itself to this kind of thinking. But I also hope that thinking about directorship in relation to technical elements, thematic preoccupations, genre, and artistic evolution has shown that auteur theory has value as an analytical tool. It may not capture all the nuances of how films are put together, but it's a useful shorthand that enables us to draw connections between films. Thanks for watching.